Markets crash every time there's talk of a trade war between the US and China. Also, the world is waiting to see what happens between China and Taiwan. Will China invade? What will the US do? Well, today I spoke with Professor Yasheng Huang. He was born in China. His father was part of the CCP, and his grandfather was also part of the CCP, and is now a professor in the US after graduating from Harvard. And we talk about the real economic situation in China, how a trade war would look like over the next 2 to 3 years, and more importantly, whether China will invade Taiwan. Enjoy the conversation. In the media right now, everyone's talking about the wars that are ongoing in Ukraine and Gaza. I think a lot of people are not paying enough attention to, at least people outside of Wall Street and crypto. They're not paying too much attention on another war that's brewing, and that's a trade war between the US and China. And that seems to continue to escalate to an extent that a few days ago, China did something that many thought would be unthinkable. And they kind of applied long arm restrictions to rare earth exports, which what that means, and I'll let you expand on it, is essentially any company that uses Chinese rare earth, Chinese processed or mined rare earths would need to seek permission or approval before exporting the products they produce. And taking into consideration, China refines 70% of the world's rare earths and refines about 90% and mines about 70%, has about 70% of the reserves. It essentially controls the entire industry, which is crucial for tech, for AI, and for missiles and private and fighter jets for the US. So it's a very, very important mineral that is essentially controlled by China. And China has played or has threatened to play that card a few days ago. I'd love you to expand on that, Professor, and what that means for the world and the US.
Yes. The official rationale is that it is not an export ban. It is a form of export control, which is that those who use the rare earth processed in China are required to submit applications for using the rare earth processed in China. That may be a distinction without a difference, but the Ministry of Commerce later on clarified their position. You are absolutely right. If fully implemented, this is going to send shockwaves globally because every electronic production uses rare earth, and they set the threshold so low that virtually it means that everybody has to submit an application in order to use the Chinese processed rare earth. Their explanation is that civilian usages are totally okay, but the defense-related usages are going to be scrutinized and probably prohibited. But what is the definition of civilian usage? What is the definition of defense-related usage? Is not very clear.
And it's important to note that the missiles that the US is struggling to supply Ukraine, the air defense systems are struggling to supply Israel, and is struggling to supply their other allies. Even Taiwan's got billions of military equipment that they paid the US for that they haven't received yet. All these require rare earths to be developed, require the magnets that China also manufactures, I think about 90%, 92% of. So what will be the impact on the US military and the US economy and the European economy and the rest of the world? But I think that will be mainly targeted on the US. So let's focus on the US. What would happen to the US if China goes ahead and proceeds with those restrictions?
Well, it would amount to a sudden stop in the production of the equipment and the machinery and the devices and the gadgets. But I just want to emphasize this point. Rare earth are used universally in electronic production. It's a little bit like using electricity. And so it's not really a sharp distinction between defense-related and civilian usages of the element and the magnets. The phones that we're using use rare earth. The computers we use rare earth. So it's going to be really a global, huge impact on the economy. And so it's not a very well-targeted strategy, let me put it that way.
And yeah, one would try to understand why China did this. Because it all started in February. US imposed the fentanyl tariffs on China. It's about 10%. And then later in April, the US imposed tariffs across the world, including China, but China got hit really hard, 145% tariffs. Not long afterwards, a few weeks afterwards, there was a Geneva truce for 90 days, essentially a pause on all tariffs, and it went back to 30%, which is a 10%, 20% for fentanyl and 10% reciprocal tariff. But then, so that was on May 12th. May 23rd, US took another step, and that's halting the 5-nanometer chip exports to China. So essentially, the American leverage, Professor, is the chips, the AI chips that are required for a booming industry that the world was racing to dominate. So that was done in May. Then we have in August, so a few months afterwards, the US didn't reverse that position, but essentially relaxed the restrictions, allowed 7-nanometer chips to China with further limitations. I think it's 15%. It was from NVIDIA and AMD with 15% of their revenue capped to China. So 15. And that was it. That was in August. Now, President Xi Jinping and President Trump were meant to meet in APAC, but then I think it's very, very soon, in the next few days or weeks. But what happened is a few days ago, China took a massive step that the US saw as escalatory, and that's one we're talking about. First, did I get the timeline right? And I would love you to explain why China made that step. What's the strategy behind it?
You got a broad timeline line right, but you missed one event, which happened around mid-September. The U.S. imposed docking fees on Chinese ships that carry products and dock the ports of the United States. And if you think about the shipping industry, China produces so many ships, and there are so many ships that carry goods around, and it's not just carry Chinese goods, but carry goods produced by other countries. And China also came up with a docking fee on the U.S. ship, but it doesn't have many ships, right? So essentially, that response is so asymmetrically in favor of the United States, such an unbalance between US and China. And then they announced this rare earth. I don't think the rare earth response was devised specifically to deal with the docking fees, because if you look at the rare earth documentation, it is incredibly detailed, very long, and substantial. So they probably have been doing this for some time, maybe from April when President Trump declared the Liberation Day, but they didn't announce it. And I think so this is, nobody knows, right? Because Chinese government decision making is not very transparent. My guess is that several things. One is that they are using this as a bargaining chip to prepare for a potential summit meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump later this month in South Korea.
2 weeks, yeah.
In 2 weeks. We're going to have a debate whether they overplayed that hand.
Do you think they did?
I think they did. And also this export control on rare earth is not targeted specifically against the United States. It is targeted against any user of the Chinese processed rare earth. So this is such a nuclear option of a response that is not really well tailored, well designed as a bargaining chip.
Mm.
Because you don't go after every country when you try to get a deal with the United States. And I think the other reason is probably they see some weaknesses on the part of the US. Um, if you look at what is happening to the agricultural export to China, it has virtually collapsed, right? China has not bought any soybeans. There are bankruptcies now in rural America. Farmers are protesting, and this is a harvest season. So I think they are pursuing this high pressure tactic before the summit, and I do believe they overplay their hand.
I agree. I think I'll tell you what it reminds me of. First, I want to say China seems to be the only country fighting against Trump in this tariff war that we've seen. All other countries, including neighboring countries, have reached a deal with Trump, including India, which initially showed um, strength and I want to say resilience, but kind of moved further towards China when they went to the summit, the Shanghai summit, not long after Trump imposed the tariffs against India because they're importing oil from Russia. But we found out a few days ago that now India and the US have signed a deal to gradually reduce exports to 50%, imports of 50% from Russia, oil imports. So it seems that China is the only country that's really fighting against the US, and that's the second biggest economy in the world. Now, I do agree with you. They do seem that they've overplayed their hand, and it reminds me of the US overplaying their hand over the last few years when it comes to the US dollar dominance and the dominance in the financial systems through SWIFT. And we've seen especially after what happened in Russia, Ukraine, after the war, and how they sanctioned Russia and any countries that does business with Russia and blocked Russia from the SWIFT system, froze Russian assets. That's spooked a lot of countries, and a lot of countries are gradually moving away from the US dollar and towards gold. So I feel like what China did now is speed up the self-reliance of countries when it comes to rare earths. The US is already investing in their own rare earth industry, and European countries are looking for alternatives. The US doing a deal with Ukraine that involves rare earths. I think Greenland rare earth might play a role in what Trump was trying to do with Greenland. They do hold a lot of rare earth reserves. So that's the downside, long-term downside, or repercussions of what China could face from this move.
Well, so I think there are some differences between the sort of financial sanctions imposed by the US after the Ukraine war and this particular case. Um, they are, not perfect alternatives to the reserve currency, to the dollar assets, right? Now, crypto, gold. Nevertheless, they are readily available, right? So you can go to them. So in that sense, the US leverage in terms of this financial leverage is not as strong as the Chinese leverage in rare earth. You can so I do believe you use the term long term correctly. In the long term, yes, this move by China is going to motivate other countries to create their processing capacity. Rare earths, first of all, are not that rare, but it is the processing that is rare, that is concentrated, right? So other countries are going to be motivated to create their processing facilities and capacity. Japan is also innovating products that can be substitutes for rare earth. That may take a while, but that's not going to help the United States in the immediate short run. Inflation is rising in this country. The trade with China is incredibly important. Christmas season is approaching. Whatever you can do on the rare earth front today is not going to help you to solve that problem, right? So in that sense, China does have a substantial bargaining leverage vis-a-vis the United States in the short run. The way I think about this is analogous to what happened to Apple production in 2022 when China imposed zero COVID controls. That sent shockwaves to companies such as Apple, to Foxconn. They view China as a very reliable manufacturing site of their phones, of their iPods and iPads. But that event shook their confidence, and they began to move some of their production to Vietnam, to India. But that's going to take time, right? So I think the more analogous situation is that situation, which happened in 2022 when Apple began to diversify its sourcing strategy. But that's going to take time. It's not going
Yeah,
to solve the
that's a
problem.
very good point.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. I think the point you've made where for countries to move away from the US dollar, there's alternatives available immediately, gold, Bitcoin being two examples. But for countries to move off Chinese reliance on rare earths, not the mining, but the separation of the rare earths, the refining, that's a very dirty task that no other country wanted to do, even though the US was leading it in the 70s and 80s.
I think this is a fundamental difference between hard assets and soft assets, right? So the U.S. advantage in advantage, the value of the dollar, the credibility of the financial system, Federal Reserve, these are substantial advantages. I'm not questioning that, but these are sort of soft assets. And gold is hard, but it's really mainly used not for its own value, is really used as a storage of value. So it's, in essence, it's more like a currency, more like an asset. Vis-a-vis hard assets, right? Hard assets take time to establish. But I think I would argue that overplaying your hand is not going to be a wise move down the road. I think if there was any debate before this move, whether or not other countries should invest in processing capacity, processing capability, that debate is finished. There's now consensus that we should do that, right? So, I mean, in the long run, that is going to reduce the Chinese bargaining power, Chinese leverage, and also it's not good. It's not really good for Chinese economy as well, because they have established this formidable capacity, and they are making a lot of money out of it. It's a very important part of their export production. So sometimes you really have to think hard about, getting some short-term tactical advantage, which requires you to calibrate your response, and doing something really, really drastic. You may win in the short run, but you may lose in the long run.
Yeah, so for example, the US blocked the export of certain chips to China, but then the argument that Nvidia made, they're like, China will out innovate us and they will no longer rely on us, and we've given away an advantage, a long-term advantage of us supplying those chips to China. So it's kind of a similar position here. If China stops supplying of rare earths, refined rare earths and the magnets to the Western world, then the Western world will become self-sufficient and manufacture or refine its own minerals.
Yeah, but Mario, let me respond to that specific
Please.
issue a little bit more. I think time horizon is very important in this discussion. It is not terribly useful to say, okay, China is going to develop their own chips. It really matters whether or not they can develop their own chips next year, the year after, or in 5 or 10 years. From a national security perspective, it matters tremendously whether that development is to happen instantaneously or it is going to happen over a long stretch of time. I have no doubt, given what we know about Chinese engineering capability, technical capability, and the government support, China will be able to replace some of the chips now produced by NVIDIA, maybe TSMC. But from a geopolitical point of view, you would rather have China spend money on creating or recreating the chip capacity than have them spend time and efforts and money on training their algorithm and building their weapons, right? So given that's the choice, I'm not sure Yasheng Huang's explanation
That's a valid point.
is sensible, right? So if you want to postpone the war, it matters tremendously if you can do that for 3 years, as opposed to doing that only for 1 year. So I think that's the way I think about this issue. In 3 years, anything can happen, right? Leadership change, Chinese economy, and all of that.
Chinese leadership change? No. You mean a new U.S. president?
Well,
I just don't see a world where...
Let me put it, the priorities of the leadership may change, right? So I do believe that the Chinese economy is not in the best shape. To some extent, the national security objectives of the country are not serving its economic needs well, and the economic pressures are rising rather than declining. If there are going to be another 3 years of economic stagnation and problems, that may moderate their geopolitical priorities.
So talking about the Chinese economy, I remember since early 2000s, everyone's talking about the Chinese economy overheating, is going to crash, and a lot of the numbers coming out of China are fake. But yeah, then we continue seeing the Chinese economy grow year after year, and I think the growth now is about 5%. And then you get those videos coming out of China, the capacity, the technological advancements, they used to be criticized for IP theft, and now they're the leaders when it comes to intellectual property in many sectors. Robotics, they've leapfrogged the rest of the world when it comes to robotics. How are you sure the Chinese economy is weak? We understand there's a 20% youth unemployment. I know you want to jump in. There's the household, the property sector is not doing too well. Household wealth has gone down. Household spending's gone down. But somehow the economy still hums along pretty strongly.
Yeah. So let's separate the two issues. One is the economic growth, economic development, and the others are technology. I'll deal with them separately and try to integrate the discussion. So going back to the first point you made, which is that there were people in the early 2000s who predicted the collapse of the Chinese economy. They were proven totally wrong, right? So as we know now, this is the year 2025, and Chinese economy has not collapsed. But I think we can keep two ideas in our head. One is that those who predicted the economic collapse in the early 2000s were incorrect, and I would argue grossly incorrect, and also their analysis was incredibly flawed. We can keep that idea and then entertain the idea that Chinese economy today is experiencing some substantial strains. I'm not going to use word like collapse, but I think the appropriate word is economic strains, distresses. I'm willing to use those terms. One huge difference between then and now is the debt level. So the Chinese debt to GDP ratio, in the early 2000s, it was there was very low level, and for in the 1980s, 1990s, and the first decade of the 21st century, the debt level relative to GDP stayed flat. Beginning in 2008, that curve moved sharply upward. And so when we think about stress, we typically associate stress with financial burdens, financial costs of squeezing capital in order to produce 1 percentage point of the GDP growth. In terms of that ratio, what is known as the incremental capital to output ratio, the amount of capital you need to generate 1 percentage point of the GDP today is, 5 to 7 times as compared with the early 2000s, right? So the economy is becoming less efficient from a capital perspective. We can come back to the technology later on. But that's actually what matters in terms of sustainable economic growth. If you look at the productivity numbers of the Chinese economy, they're all trending downward. When those people who predicted collapse in early 2000, they didn't look at the productivity numbers, they didn't look at the debt numbers. The productivity performance was very strong. Very, very strong.
How's productivity going down now? Like the Ford CEO just a few days ago said he went to see the dark factories in China, and he said it's the most humbling thing I've ever seen. They have far superior in-vehicle technology. I see those videos. How's productivity shrinking?
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
So this is a classic distinction between kind of how should I put it, the executive business view of Chinese economy and the academic view of this issue. So I'm an academic, so I'm going to say the academic view is more correct than the executive view. When the executives are looking at those factories, robots and automation, those factories are very, very efficient. But they cannot know what they didn't see. See, this is the problem with that kind of perspective. When they go to China, they go to see certain things, right? They go to certain cities, they go to certain factories, and then they formulate their view on the basis of what they see. They don't formulate their view on the basis of what they don't see by definition, right? So essentially,
what are those things, Professor? Like, what are some of the things you think they're not seeing?
Oh, what they don't see is there are a whole bunch of enterprises that are wasting capital, that are producing goods that nobody wants in the economy, that are just sitting in the warehouses that don't go anywhere. What they don't see is in the U.S. economy. So many of these people go to China and they say, "Wow, look at the highway, look at the airports, look at the high-speed railways," and then they say, "Look at the United States, look at the terrible airports, look at the terrible highway." Okay, so let me tell you something. Logistical costs as a share of the U.S. GDP is about 7%. The logistical cost as a share of the Chinese GDP is about 14%. Double the U.S. costs.
But how does that make? That's weird because it doesn't add up to what we're seeing. Because you do see those videos. I've been to China about 10 years ago. I'm sure it's changed a lot. And when you go there, it's always a step ahead of the rest of the world. That was 10 years ago, and I used to go for business. How do you
So Mario, but I think it's really important to drill this point rather clearly. You formulate your views on the things that you see. You don't formulate your views on the things you don't see by definition, this method. Whereas we academics use data that incorporate the things that you see, but we also incorporate the things you don't see. In the end, efficiency and productivity is not a gross concept, it's a net concept. Economy-wide productivity is calculated as efficiency of the things that you see, right? Executives see, and the inefficiencies of the things you don't see. So it's a net concept. The issue is that which one in any economy you have that. So when we report productivity of the US economy, it includes the incredible productive enterprises, great enterprises that we have, technology and all of that. It also includes really some lousy enterprises and lousy services that we get from restaurants and all of that. But the issue here is that the efficiency gains are bigger than the inefficiency losses. That we say this economy is net positive in terms of productivity. Systematic academic analysis shows that Chinese, what is known as the economy-wide productivity, total factor productivity, is negative. Okay? So the inefficiency losses are bigger than the efficiency gains. So the aggregate effect is negative. So I'm not denying that the impressive devices, impressive infrastructures that they have built, I'm not denying that at all. All I'm saying is that there are a lot of waste in that economy, and those waste overwhelm these efficiency gains.
Okay, that helps me reconcile the 2 points. And I do remember, there are things we do end up seeing, even though they try to hide them. I remember a long time ago, there were all these buildings that you saw China booming, and there were all these buildings, like cities that were just completely empty. Do you remember that?
Nobody
lived, ghost towns, ghost cities. Yeah, is that still happening?
So by definition, it is happening because they have overbuilt. And the houses, the apartments use a lot of materials, steel, aluminum, bricks, ceramics, and all of that. That industry has been built to today. So you have this huge capacity that has been built, but then you have the output, which is houses that are not occupied, right? And this explains why the debt level is so high, because usually when you have a very efficient economy, you can use less capital to generate more output. But now, because efficiency is so low, you need to use more and more capital to generate the same output, right? So, so this is a kind of analytical schism between business types and people like me, an academic, because we look at the economy as a whole rather than just looking at a few factories or a few airports.
Or some TikTok videos that people scroll through saying, "Holy shit, look what China has," and they don't understand is that at what cost, and what are the things that you don't see on those TikTok reels. What do you make of?
That's absolutely right.
What do you make of there's another metric that scares me, Professor, is for every warship that the US produces, I'm sure you've seen it, China can produce not 1, not 2, not 5, not 10, not 100, but 300 warships. I had to fact check that number because I thought it was impossible. There's no way this is possible. And you've got the same level of capacity and leapfrogs happening in the renewable energy sector. How about those 2 specific points? How concerning do you find those?
Well, I'm concerned from a national security point of view, right? And I think that in the last years, China is moving very rapidly toward a wartime economy rather than an economy, right? The way I define economy is an economy that generates employment, income gains to the 1.3, 1.4 billion Chinese people. The wartime economy, the Soviet Union had some of that, right? So tanks, nuclear weapons. Soviet Union is an extreme case of it. I'm not saying China today is like Soviet Union, But China has been moving in the direction of the Soviet Union in that sense. The warships, they are good for fighting wars. I can't think of another use of the warships. We can argue U.S. is building too many weapons. U.S. may not build that many ships, but U.S. is building aircraft carriers and
A lot of
planes.
fighter jets.
You
A
know,
lot of fighter jets. Yeah.
and the defense budget is what, $500 billion
Yeah.
a year. So
Yes.
I think we can
That's a
level that criticism against both China and the United States.
yeah. Yeah, there's also China's got a massive advantage when it comes to drone manufacturing. And
Sure.
that's shown how important it is with the war in Ukraine and to an extent in the war in Iran as well. Why do you think China is doing all this? We understand that the ambitions of having Taiwan being under one country, being part of China, and the timelines being set between 2027 and 2049. A lot of people pointing to 2027. Um, what's your stance on a potential conflict in Taiwan, and how big of a role is that playing on China's more and more military focused economy?
So this is related to our earlier discussion, right? About chips vis-a-vis developing chips, developing capability to produce advanced chips, vis-a-vis using currently advanced chips to build weaponry and to train algorithms and for war fighting purposes. I'll get to your question quickly, but I do want to say that the national security concern is a very legitimate concern. And I think the U.S. policy, the policy of other countries should think about this issue very, very seriously. And the way I think about this is that a peace is war delayed. You delay the war. And I think the imperative to delay the war on Taiwan, for example, is a paramount. And so we should think about the export control policy from that perspective. In
Yeah,
terms of
it's a good status quo to maintain. Like China's done incredibly well under this status quo of China and Taiwan being ambiguously two separate nations. The US is the US, and Taiwan's done incredibly well. Japan and all neighboring countries have done relatively well. So yeah, it is a good status quo to have.
status quo has been fantastic for China, for Taiwan, for US, for Japan, right? So I hold whatever leader responsible who is going to change that status quo. And I'm saying this about the Chinese leadership, but I'm also saying this about Taiwanese leadership. I'm worried about the Taiwanese leadership. I think they are now more explicit about getting, formal recognition of their
Recognition.
independence. I mean, they have de facto independence. They don't have a de jure independence. But under that de facto independence, they have grown into a rich economy. The TSMC is a powerful company. Foxconn is a powerful company. There are people, the Taiwanese people have a much higher living standard as compared with people in mainland China. They have a vibrant democracy, right? So the diplomatic recognition has been totally irrelevant to the welfare of the Taiwanese people. And I'm worried about the current Taiwanese leader who is edging closer and closer toward a formal declaration or position on independence. I'm also worried about some of the rhetoric coming from some US politicians sort of nudging or encouraging them to move toward independence. But I'm also worried about China, right? So the reunification schedule, one of the things that Deng Xiaoping said many years ago, which I thought was a very, very clever formula. He said, our generation is not smart enough to solve this problem. Let's just delay it, and let the future generation deal with this problem. I think for China, the imperative is still to develop the economy, to maintain GDP growth, to improve the living standard of the Chinese people, rather than occupy additional land. I just don't really see any rational reason for doing that.
There is so Russia has sorry, not Russia. China has two big weaknesses when it comes to, and I'd love you to elaborate on them as the expert. But from what I see, it has two weaknesses when it comes to imports in general, especially when it comes to oil. It's relying on cheap Russian oil, and not sure how that relationship is going to look like, because China and Russia have historically been rivals. If once a peace deal is reached in Ukraine, and there's the Malacca Straits, which the majority of Chinese imports go through, and that's between it's between Indonesia and what two countries is the Malacca Straits between?
Malaysia, right?
Malaysia and Indonesia. Essentially, so these are both US allies. And then you've got the island wall that the US has formed militarily around China. So essentially, if China does invade Taiwan, um, it will struggle immensely from an imports perspective, especially when it comes to oil. But also, some would argue it requires Taiwan to be able to break that deadlock, because their whole navy will not be able to exit the South China Sea without having some sort of pathway, some sort of straits out of that area. And that's currently controlled by the US and US allies.
Yeah, so I'm not a military expert. I don't really know the kind of the war tactics very well. All I'm saying is that the day that China is going to invade Taiwan, that's the end of the day of a Chinese economy, right? In part because of the weaknesses you described, also in part that the whole economy is going to be a wartime economy. And that is not the engine of the growth for Chinese economy, right? Chinese economy is very dependent on exports. Chinese economy is very dependent on consumers and in China, wartime economy is totally it's almost a different type of economy as compared with what Chinese economy needs today, and
Professor, I want to
such a
ask you something.
high level of debt, right? So that is going to be the end of the Chinese economy.
There's something else, Professor, I've been thinking a lot about recently, especially when we're seeing that polarization in the US, especially after the Charlie Kirk assassination. Um, w- I've been looking at democracies, and they do seem, I love democracies. I've lived in one in Australia, but they do have weaknesses. They do have flaws. One of them is systemic flaws. They're being exploited in different ways. And another one is just they seem very inefficient. Now, what China's done as an authoritarian nation is that they've managed to focus on the long-term horizon, not worry about the press, not worry about opposition. They don't have any opposition. And, I've been raised to believe this is not the right way to govern. Um, but it's worked for them. Now, I'm trying to understand if this is a right way to govern, and democracy, which is relatively new, might have flaws, and authoritarianism might be advantageous in some ways. Um, so I would love to get your thoughts on it, and what you think of the Chinese model, and because there's not many other nations, large nations, that have achieved that level of success through that way of governing.
Well, so there's a I think what you said is I agree with some of it. I think that it's important to make a distinction between democracy as ideally constructed and democracy that is currently being implemented. And I'm not as familiar with Australia, but I'm reasonably familiar with the United States. I think there's no question that the United States has a very flawed political system. But if we look at this issue deeply, it is flawed precisely in those areas where the US system is most autocratic. Look at the dysfunctions of the US government, where the dysfunctions are. The Senate, right? The gerrymandering. Is gerrymandering democratic in any sort of reasonable description of a democracy, right? Gerrymandering is designed to shape the electoral districts so that to reduce the power of certain electorate. The Senate has 100 senators. Each state has 2 senators, whether you are California or whether you are Wyoming. Is Electoral College democratic? Electoral College is deeply anti-democratic. It gives 7 times more voting power to people who live in Wyoming as compared with people who live in California. The simple, this is not the only definition, but the simple definition of democracy is that kind of majority voice, majority votes should be more important in certain domains than the minority voices and minority views. The US political system does not even satisfy that requirement. I actually think that if US system is more democratic, look at the gun control. Look at the gun control. Systematically, the US political system is designed against gun control, even though there are more deaths from gun violence than there are from traffic accidents. Something like 40,000 people every year in the United States die from gun violence. But for years and years, for decades and decades, they cannot fix that problem. Healthcare. For years and years, US cannot solve that problem because of the opposition from a very small number of the politicians.
So you're saying, interesting. So you're saying a centralization of power, example, lobbying groups, example, the flawed voting system in the US. Those are the weaknesses of a democracy, not the democracy within itself. But I'll ask you this question, the following.
They actually fail democracy, right? So if you can buy the policy through money rather than through the ballot box, I would debate anyone who argues this is democracy. This is not democracy. This is oligarchy.
But it's an incredible democracy if you compare to China, though.
Oh, that's absolutely true, right? In the sense of the elections, in the sense of a free press and freedom of the speech.
Doesn't China show that authoritarian governments could actually function and do well, at least in the short term? In the long term, it's a different question.
Not at all. So first of all, let me just make a methodological point. We should think about China, we should think about US, and think about Australia, not as sort of compare with each other. We should really compare themselves against themselves, right? So I think the US can do much better if US has a slightly different system, more democratic system. Let me put it that way. They can reduce the gun death. They can build more infrastructure if the system is designed better. For China, so I'm going to have a new book coming out in January 2026. If you look at, you're correct to say that Chinese autocracy is very good at growing GDP. But within the last 40 years, there's a huge difference in terms of household income growth, personal income. So you receive a salary, I receive a salary from my employer, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. As a regular citizen, as As a scholar, I care about GDP. As a regular citizen, you don't really care about GDP. You care about your personal paycheck. It turns out that the personal income growth in China of Chinese people, I'm not talking about Chinese government, Chinese people, was highest when Chinese political system was more open. And that was in the 1980s, was more open. So it was not a democracy for sure, but sometimes we lump all these things in the same category, autocracy. There are some more open autocracies. There are some more closed autocracies, right? If you look at East Asia, Taiwan was an autocracy, South Korea was an autocracy. Their economy grew fantastically in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. Well, but North Korea was also autocracy. China under Mao was also autocracy. They didn't grow at all as compared with Taiwan and South Korea. It is precisely because under Deng Xiaoping, China became less autocratic. It was still an autocratic system, but it became less autocratic. And then it began to grow, right? So the correlation is actually between the political system becoming more open and less autocratic and good economic growth. If you look at the Chinese regions, it is especially those regions that were less controlled by the central government that began to grow strongly. Those regions in China that are under strong, tight controls of the central government, they have performed poorly in the last 40 years relative to those regions that are less controlled by the central government. So I think the totality of the evidence does not support the idea that autocracy is the reason why China has grown so quickly.
Well, that's good to hear. It's like, for example, under President Xi Jinping, it obviously became more autocratic. The term limits have been removed. President for life. Yet you're saying GDP grew as a whole. The country grew, but domestic household net worth has not grown as much and is still lagging because autocracy is not as effective as a democracy.
So if you look at the Chinese leaders since 1949, and I ask you to name two leaders that are most autocratic, you'll probably name Mao, right, for sure, and Xi Jinping. Okay? So Mao didn't grow the Chinese economy. China remained very poor in 1976 when he died. Under Xi Jinping, the economy slowed down substantially, from 8%, 9% to now, officially speaking, 5%. There are alternative estimates that say
What are they?
The alternative estimate put it between 1.5 and 3%. Okay.
Oh wow!
So
That's
this
a
is
big
a
difference.
this is a
That's lower than
huge.
the US.
This is a huge and at a fraction of the per capita GDP as the US. For per capita GDP, Chinese is about 25% of the US per capita GDP. Aggregate GDP is bigger, but China has a bigger population. So at a fraction of the US per capita GDP, if you're growing at 1.5%, to me that's a failure. Okay, so now I ask you, right, the following question, is the most autocratic leader in China most successfully, economically speaking? The answer to that is clearly no. Mao is the most autocratic. Under his leadership, Chinese economy didn't grow. Xi Jinping, compared with Deng Xiaoping, compared with previous leaders, I'm not saying Xi Jinping is the same as Mao Zedong, but compare with Deng Xiaoping, compare with the previous leaders, he's more autocratic, and yet Chinese economy slowed down, right? The correlation is exactly the opposite from the one that we often hear, which is that autocracy delivers the robust economic growth for China. That's just absolutely not true.
Interesting. Well, again, that's really, really reassuring to hear. The last topic I want to ask you about, Professor, is just Trump as a whole and his strategy when it comes to China. When it comes to the world, I feel like he's been very aggressive, including to allies. Yet he's reached a deal with all those countries, and they all know that the political system in the U.S. The president's only there for 4 to 8 years. Trump only has 3 more years, so a lot of them have kowtowed to Trump's demands and reached some sort of agreement. Many saw Trump's strategy as alienating allies, and China was initially trying to take advantage of that position, trying to build better relations with Europe, try to take America's position as the stable player in the global economy. But it seems that's changed now with China's rare earths moves. Would love to get your thoughts on Trump's strategy and how China's responding as a whole.
I think the Trump administration has elevated the prestige, legitimacy, and the status of autocratic leaders such as Putin, such as Xi Jinping, Orban, and people like that. So there's a legitimacy boost to the autocracy because of the Trump administration. So in terms of ideological balance of power, it has shifted in favor of autocracy. And we're going to see that for the next 3 years as well. But in terms of the real kind of economic balance of power, geopolitical balance of power, that depends on what China does and depends on what these other countries do. In terms of the sort of geopolitical balancing and economic balancing, I think it would be a very easy, not a very easy, but it will be relatively easy thing for China and Europe to move closer to each other because both of them shared some degree of distrust of the Trump administration. The blocking obstacle of that is the Chinese position on Ukraine, right? And the rare earth definitely does not advance that relationship. But previous to that, it was the Chinese position on Ukraine. If China revises its position on Ukraine, not necessarily going all the way against Russia, but at least moving toward a more neutral position, and China can intermediate between Ukraine and Russia, given China's power, or not power, but given China's influence over Russia. I think Europe will be eager to move closer to China, right? I think
That's a good point.
I really, my worry is about Europe. Europe is caught between Trump's America and China, and with the Ukraine on their front door, and they don't really think about either the US or China as a reliable partner. I think that is not a very good position for them to be in.
But at least they know that in the US there'll be a new president that could change his strategy when it comes to European relations, where in China in 3 years' time will probably continue being President Xi Jinping.
Yeah, so let me add one point on this.
Please.
I think other leaders, including Indian leaders, understand Trump better than the Chinese leaders, which is that Trump is a transactional president, and you want to do transactions with him to safeguard the larger economic interests of your country. What Trump wants is a showmanship, right? So he enjoys people kissing his ring, and these democratically elected leaders, and I believe that they are doing the right thing to kiss his ring, because their ultimate responsibility is employment in their own countries, is economic growth in their own countries, rather than confronting President Trump. Zelensky did exactly the right thing. He kissed his ring, right? So
Yeah.
I
He's now wearing a suit.
That's actually the kind of the political fiduciary responsibility of these leaders. And I gave them very hard remarks, even though I really don't enjoy saying that.
Professor, it's been an incredible conversation. I appreciate you spending the time with us to explain the trade war that we're seeing, the whole talk about rare earth restrictions by China, what that could lead to, and more importantly, the general geopolitical situation between the two powerhouses, the US and China. It was a great discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoy talking to you, Mario.